All right, let's do this. The Mahabharata's nuclear weapon. Close your eyes and picture a weapon described in Sanskrit approximately 3,000 years ago. Not a sword, not a siege engine. A single projectile, the ancient text says, charged with all the power of the universe, releasing a blinding flash brighter than 10,000 suns, followed by a column of smoke and fire that rises and expands like an umbrella into the sky. The Sauptika Parva of the Mahabharata doesn't gesture at destruction. It itemizes it. In roughly 1500 BC, the most sophisticated weapons on Earth were bronze-tipped arrows and battering rams. The concept of energy released from matter didn't exist in any scientific framework. Yet the Mahabharata describes, in sequential clinical detail, a weapon's detonation, the shockwave, the thermal pulse, and then something stranger. Survivors' hair and nails fall out. Food becomes poisonous. Rivers run black. Soldiers wade into water and scrub themselves and their equipment clean. That last detail is not poetry. That is a decontamination protocol. On July 16, 1945, J. Robert Oppenheimer watched the Trinity test detonate over the New Mexico desert and quoted the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." When asked later whether this was the first nuclear explosion in history, he did not say yes. He said, "In modern times, yes." Oppenheimer had read the Mahabharata. He did not treat it as mythology. Separately, Nobel laureate chemist Frederick Soddy wrote in 1909 that ancient texts appeared to describe atomic energy with uncomfortable specificity. Decades before the Manhattan Project confirmed it was possible. Some researchers have also pointed to the ancient site of Mohenjo-Daro in present-day Pakistan, where fused and crystallized stone has been found at a localized epicenter, a phenomenon associated with extreme, concentrated heat events. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to craft furnaces. Other analysts note the pattern matches no known ancient industrial process. If the Mahabharata was myth, it was myth with a blast radius, a fallout pattern, and a decontamination procedure. The man who built this actual bomb recognized the description. He just didn't say so out loud. Tesla and the Vedic transmission. In February of 1896, Nikola Tesla sat across a table in New York from Swami Vivekananda, one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century, and the two men discovered they were describing the same thing using different languages. Tesla had spent years trying to articulate what he sensed beneath the mathematics of electromagnetic fields, a primary substance, invisible, omnipresent, through which energy moved without physical medium. Vivekananda called it Akasha. He had learned the concept from texts composed 3,000 years earlier. The dominant scientific framework of the late 19th century held that energy required a physical medium to travel. Light moved through ether. Current moved through wire. The notion of a field, an invisible structure of space itself that carried and transmitted energy, was radical enough that it took Einstein's work in 1905 to begin formalizing it. Tesla was already there, and he had found a map. Tesla wrote in his paper, Man's Greatest Achievement, published in 1907, that all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance filling all space, acted upon by a life-giving force. He used the Sanskrit terms directly: Akasha, the field, and prana, the animating energy within it. His patent number 6,45576, filed in 1900, describes energy transmission through a medium that fills all space, language, nearly identical to the Rigveda's description of a force moving through the invisible fabric of the cosmos. The Rigveda was composed approximately 1500 to 1200 BC. Tesla's patent was filed roughly 3,000 years later. Vivekananda wrote to a colleague after his meetings with Tesla that the inventor believed he could mathematically prove the Vedic description of the universe. Tesla never fully achieved that proof. But the conceptual architecture of the quantum field, now the foundation of modern physics, describes exactly what the Vedic texts called Akasha, an invisible, omnipresent medium through which energy propagates, collapses, and reorganizes. Tesla rewired the modern world. He said, in documented writing, that his framework came from a 3,000-year-old source. We spent a century celebrating the invention and never once seriously asked about the instruction manual. Roger Bacon's Letter to a Cardinal. Sometime around 1260 AD, a Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon, working in a cell in Oxford, wrote a letter to a cardinal that reads less like theology and more like a declassified technical inventory. In it, Bacon describes, with functional specificity, instruments by which a man may walk safely underwater for a considerable time, cars that move with unbelievable rapidity without any animal pulling them, and instruments of flying in which a man sits, and by turning a mechanism causes skillfully contrived wings to beat the air. He was writing in the 13th century. He was describing the submarine, the automobile, and the airplane. Roger Bacon was not a mystic. He was an empiricist, one of the earliest advocates of experimental science in medieval Europe. In his letter, the Epistola de Secretis Operibus Artis et Naturae was not a collection of fantasies. It was structured as a catalog, a methodical list of devices written in the tone of someone documenting things they believe to exist. The submarine wouldn't become a functional military vessel until the 1800s. The automobile wouldn't arrive until the 1880s. Powered flight waited until 1903. Bacon was 600 years early on all three, in a single document. What makes the letter genuinely strange is a sentence most people miss. Bacon explicitly states he is not inventing these descriptions. He writes that he is drawing from the letters of Julius Firmicus and other ancient authorities, sources he had accessed through scholarly networks. He was transcribing, not imagining. The four technologies he describes, submarine, automobile, aircraft, and large ships operated by a single man, all became operational realities within a span of roughly 60 years in the 19th and 20th centuries, as though someone had set a timer. Bacon was placed under house arrest by the Franciscan order around 1278. His writings were suppressed. The Epistola survived in only a handful of manuscript copies and was not widely distributed until 1618, more than 350 years after he wrote it. He said he was copying from older documents. Those documents no longer exist. Whatever library Bacon accessed, it contained a list of machines that humanity would spend the next 6 centuries slowly learning to build from scratch. Hildegard von Bingen and the Invisible Enemy. In 1151 AD, a Benedictine abbess named Hildegard von Bingen, working in a monastery on the Rhine, completed a medical encyclopedia that described the human body's internal defense against disease with a precision that medicine would not officially reach for another 700 years. She called the force viriditas, a vital animating power that maintained health by resisting what she described as invisible corruptions that enter through the breath. Louis Pasteur would not propose germ theory until 1857. Hildegard had already written the patient intake form. Medieval medicine in the 12th century operated under Galenic doctrine, a system inherited from ancient Greece that attributed illness to imbalances of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea that disease was caused by external agents too small to see was not part of any recognized framework. Hildegard rejected the humoral system entirely, describing instead a model in which external invisible agents entered the body through respiration and were met and neutralized by an internal defensive force. That is, functionally, the immune system. Her text, Causae et Curae, identifies specific plants as capable of strengthening this internal defense. Elderberry, which she prescribed for respiratory illness, was confirmed in a 1995 peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine to have measurable antiviral properties. Fennel and cloves, also prescribed by Hildegard for systemic infection, have both been validated in modern pharmacological research. She also described the digestive tract as the seat of overall systemic health, a position now supported by decades of gut microbiome research, and noted that grief and sustained fear weakened the body's resistance to corruption, a description consistent with modern psychoneuroimmunology. Hildegard said her knowledge came through mystical visions she called scivias, meaning knowing the ways. Modern neurologists have proposed these visions may have been complex migraines with visual aura. Neither explanation accounts for the pharmacological accuracy of her prescriptions or the structural correctness of her immune framework. She described the mechanism, identified the agents, named the compounds that counter them, and got the anatomy right. The only thing she couldn't explain was how she knew: the Baghdad battery. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig reached into a storage box in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and pulled out an ordinary-looking clay jar, roughly 14 centimeters tall, sealed with asphalt at the top. Inside was a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod. Koenig turned it over in his hands for a long moment. Then he recognized what he was holding. The jar was a galvanic cell. It was a battery. It had been sitting in storage, unidentified, for years. It was approximately 2,000 years old. The dominant assumption about the ancient world is a clean, linear progression: stone, then bronze, then iron, then electricity. The concept of electrical current was not formalized until Alessandro Volta built his voltaic pile in 1799. The idea that any pre-modern culture had isolated and applied the principles of electrochemistry sits outside the standard model of technological history entirely. Koenig's find didn't fit the timeline, so for decades, the academic response was to question the identification rather than revise the timeline. In 1978, Egyptologist Arne Egebrecht built a working replica of the Baghdad battery and filled it with grape juice as an electrolyte. It produced 0.87 volts of electricity, sufficient to electroplate a thin layer of gold onto a silver figurine. The replication was documented. The device worked. Volta had invented the battery in 1799. Someone in Parthian-era Iraq, in the territory between roughly 250 BC and 224 AD, had built the same device approximately 2,000 years earlier. At least a dozen similar clay vessels have been found at the same site, which means this was not a one-off accident. They were being produced. Some researchers have proposed that metallic artifacts from the same region and period show traces consistent with electroplating, a process that requires electrical current. Mainstream archaeology has not confirmed this as established. What is confirmed is the device itself, functional, reproducible, and 2 millennia early. Volta invented the battery in 1799. The Parthians beat him by 2,000 years. What remains unanswered is not whether the device worked. It's what they were using it for. Leonardo's confession. In 1495, Leonardo da Vinci sat in Milan and designed a fully functional humanoid robot. Not a conceptual sketch. A working machine with internal cable and pulley systems replicating human muscle groups, a jointed armature, and a complete set of operating mechanics. In 2002, NASA roboticist Mark Rosheim built a working replica directly from Leonardo's Codex drawings, with no modifications, no interpretive leaps, no reverse engineering. The robot worked exactly as drawn. That precision is not the strange part. The strange part is a single line, buried in the notebook, that almost no one discusses. Leonardo is celebrated as the supreme example of individual genius, a lone mind so far ahead of his era that the gap between his ideas and their realization stretched centuries. His anatomical drawings describe the function of the aortic valve with an accuracy not confirmed by modern medicine until echocardiography arrived in the 1970s. He described the heart as a muscular pump at a time when dominant Galenic doctrine held that the heart produced vital heat and spirits, a position not overturned until William Harvey's work in 1628. Leonardo wasn't guessing. He had seen something. His notebooks repeatedly reference what he calls ancient masters and the books of the ancients as sources for his most advanced work. The Medici Library in Florence, which Leonardo accessed through scholarly networks, contained manuscripts rescued from the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, cataloged but not fully published. The specific texts Leonardo drew from have never been identified. In the codex containing the robot design, scholars have noted a phrase that has no clear antecedent in Renaissance philosophy. Let the ancient memory speak through the new hand. Whether or not that phrase is read as mystical, its implication is structural. Leonardo did not present himself as an inventor generating new knowledge. He presented himself as a translator recovering old knowledge and expressing it through new craft. The most celebrated genius in history left written notes saying he was working from someone else's blueprints. We spent 500 years celebrating the copy and never seriously asked where the original went. The device that shouldn't exist. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera hauled a corroded bronze lump from a Roman shipwreck sitting 45 meters below the surface. The lump sat in the Athens National Archaeological Museum for decades, misidentified, misunderstood, and largely ignored. In 1951, historian Derek de Sola. Price finally examined it properly and went quiet for a long time. What he was looking at was a geared mechanical computer. It was built in approximately 87 BC. The next device of equivalent mechanical complexity would not appear for 1400 years. The Antikythera mechanism contains at least 37 interlocking bronze gears, precision cut to tolerances of approximately 1/10 of a millimeter, matching modern watchmaking standards achieved without modern tools. The 14th century gap between this device and the next comparable mechanism, the astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe, has no explanation in the standard model of technological progress. Complexity doesn't disappear. Industries don't vanish without trace. And yet, the entire manufacturing tradition that produced the Antikythera mechanism left no intermediate steps in the archaeological record. In 2006, Tony Freeth and colleagues published their analysis in Nature, confirming the mechanism predicted solar and lunar eclipses using the Saros cycle of 223 months, tracked the positions of 5 known planets, and calculated the 4-year Olympiad cycle while simultaneously displaying the Egyptian and Greek calendars. In 2021, the same team published a complete reconstruction in Scientific Reports, revealing a front panel that modeled the motion of the entire known cosmos, with the sun, moon, and planets displayed simultaneously as a real-time model. This is not an instrument. It is a computer. It takes a date as input and produces multiple correct outputs through mechanical calculation. The Roman orator Cicero described a device made by Archimedes that functioned identically. If Cicero's description is accurate, the Antikythera mechanism was not a unique object, but a product, part of a manufacturing tradition that somehow produced precision astronomical computers in the 1st century BC and then vanished completely. We found one. Cicero said there were more. Where the rest went and what else they were computing remains one of the most precise and uncomfortable open questions in the history of science. Paracelsus and the sleeping powder. In 1540, a Swiss physician named Paracelsus, working from his notes in Central Europe, synthesized a compound he called oleum dulce vitrioli, sweet oil of vitriol. He administered it to chickens. They fell into a deep, painless sleep and woke unharmed. He wrote down exactly what the compound was, exactly what it did, and noted its potential application for human surgery. We call the compound ether. The first documented use of ether anesthesia on a human patient occurred on October 16, 1846, when William Morton demonstrated it at Massachusetts General Hospital. That is 306 years after Paracelsus wrote the formula, during which time surgeons continued operating on fully conscious, restrained patients. The history of medicine in the 3 centuries between Paracelsus and Morton is a history of unnecessary suffering at scale. Surgery before anesthesia was a controlled form of torture, fast by necessity, brutal by design, and survived partly by shock. The concept that a patient could be rendered unconscious, operated upon, and returned to consciousness without trauma was not considered achievable. Paracelsus had already achieved it, documented it, and moved on. Beyond ether, Paracelsus formulated the principle, dosis sola facit venenum. The dose alone makes the poison, which became the foundational axiom of modern pharmacology and toxicology, formally adopted by the field in the 20th century. His text, Archidoxis, written around 1526, describes isolating the active chemical essence from plant matter, predating the concept of pharmaceutical active ingredients by roughly 300 years. He described mercury compounds for treating syphilis, a use validated by later chemistry. He described the relationship between external agents and disease in terms that anticipated germ theory by 3 centuries. Paracelsus claimed his knowledge came from traveling among miners, folk healers, and Arabic sources he had accessed in Istanbul. His writings reference older Eastern texts that have never been fully cataloged or identified. When he arrived in Basel in 1527, he publicly burned the works of Galen and Avicenna, the medical establishment's founding texts, calling them lies that kill. He was expelled from the city within a year. He wrote the formula in 1540. We used it for the first time in 1846. Between those 2 dates, medicine chose the textbooks over the letter. The patients paid the price. Tesla's letter to Morgan. In December of 1899, Nikola Tesla wrote a letter from his Colorado Springs laboratory that described, in precise engineering terms, a global system through which any person anywhere on Earth could send and receive messages, music, images, and financial data instantly, through a wireless network accessible via a unique personal identification number assigned to each individual user. He sent the letter to financier J.P. Morgan and asked for continued funding. Morgan reviewed the proposal and cut off Tesla's money. He called it impractical. We call it the Internet. The letter is archived in the Morgan papers at the Library of Congress. Tesla's world system, as he called it in his 1900 Century Magazine article, The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, was not a vague futurist dream. It was a specification document. He described person-to-person global messaging, real-time transmission of stock market data, worldwide broadcasting of music and speech, secure personal communications, and a universal addressing system in which each user held a unique numerical identifier. The structural parallel to an IP address is not a metaphor. It is a direct functional equivalence. The World Wide Web's foundational proposal, submitted by Tim Berners-Lee to CERN in March of 1989, describes a system of globally linked information nodes with individual addressing. Tesla had written the same architecture 89 years earlier. Patent Num. 787412, filed in 1900 and granted in 1906, describes global energy and information transmission using the Earth itself as a conductor, through a medium that Tesla described as filling all space. The physical prototype, Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, was seized by the United States government in 1917, citing national security concerns, and demolished the same year. Tesla's chief engineer at the time reported that the underground components, tunnels, and resonance chambers extending deep beneath the tower were never fully excavated. They were filled in. The letter still exists. The patent still exists. The archive is public. Morgan called it fantasy in 1899. The world went online in 1991. 92 years later, we built exactly what Tesla specified, and we gave the credit to someone else. The Sumerian King List. There is a clay tablet in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford called the Weld Blundell Prism. It is approximately 4,000 years old, written in Sumer around 2017 BC, and it is a list of kings, names, cities, lengths of reign. It reads like a standard historical document until you reach the opening section, the period it labels as before the flood. There, the reign lengths are not decades or centuries. They are tens of thousands of years. One king ruled for 28,000 years, another for 36,000, another for 72,000. The scribes were not being poetic. They were preserving a record. And buried in the arithmetic of that record is a description of something that should not exist. The Weld-Blundell Prism is the most complete of at least 18 known copies of the Sumerian king list, a text that was clearly considered important enough to copy and recopy across centuries. The pre-flood section names 5 cities as seats of kingship: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. All 5 have been archaeologically confirmed to exist. All 5 show a major flood layer in their stratigraphic record, consistent with a catastrophic regional inundation event dated to approximately 2900 BC. The same event confirmed by Sir Leonard Woolley's 1929 excavations at Ur, where he found an 8-foot sterile silt layer interrupting continuous occupation. The text describes a flood. The ground confirms it. The pre-flood reign lengths, when analyzed through the Sumerian sexagesimal, or base 60, number system, are not random exaggerations. Some researchers have noted that they are all multiples of the Saros cycle, the 6,585-day astronomical period used to predict eclipses, the same cycle encoded in the Antikythera mechanism. If accurate, this means the enormous rain numbers are not mythology. They are astronomical calendar notation, a system of timekeeping so precise it required knowledge of the cosmos that no civilization in the standard historical record should have possessed at that date. The last king listed before the flood is named Ziusudra. He is not presented as a god or a symbol. He is assigned a city, Shuruppak, a lineage, and a successor. Shuruppak has been excavated. It is real. The flood layer at Shuruppak is real. The last king before the world ended has a confirmed address. Every civilization we have studied left a version of the same message. There was something before us, something greater, and it ended in water. The Sumerians did not just say it. They gave us the name of the last king, the name of his city, and the coordinates of the flood that erased everything he knew. We found the city. We found the flood layer. The record has held up at every point where it can be tested. What we have not yet found is the civilization it was written to preserve. 10 documents. 3,000 years of compression. The Mahabharata describes a weapon we needed the 20th century to build. Hildegard describes a biological system we needed microscopes to confirm. Tesla describes a global network we needed satellites and fiber optic cable to construct. Bacon lists 4 machines that took 600 years to manufacture. The Sumerian scribes describe a civilization whose flood layer we have now physically confirmed. In every case, the knowledge arrived before the infrastructure to use it. In every case, the source was older documents, lost sources, ancient masters, or visions no one could explain. These are not coincidences scattered across history. They are a pattern. And the pattern suggests that at some point, someone understood something about our trajectory clearly enough to write it down and send it forward. The question that remains is not whether the letters were written. It is whether we are finally capable of reading them without flinching. If that question is still open for you, leave your answer in the comments. Tell us which letter hit hardest and why. And subscribe, because this archive is far from closed. The letters have always been there, buried in clay, pressed into parchment, locked in museum storage boxes for decades before anyone recognized what they held. The only thing that changed was the moment someone looked closer. Look closer.